Hi, Mrs. Colgan again, just picking back up where I left off. When I pointed out that neither Danny nor Doug was even in class and that they were probably taking the whole day off and maybe they were sitting in Yankee Stadium already, watching batting practice with Horace Clarke and Joe Pempitone, hitting them out a mile, Mrs. Baker pointed out that run-on sentences were improper and that I would do well to get started on the non-restrictive clauses worksheet. Which I did, since the prospect of opening day at Yankee Stadium made even non-restrictive clauses bearable. And it probably helped that Danny and Doug would have to do all the work the next day anyway. By the time noon came, my hands were blue with the fresh Ditto ink, but I had finished every non-restrictive clause exercise and done the reading comprehension and even done more to make the California Gold Rush relevant to you by pointing out the perils of the love of money in a brilliantly worded argument from Mr. Petrelli, which I handed to Mrs. Baker while everyone went out to lunch recess. "Why don't you take this down to his room?" she said. "By that time your father will be here." So I did, and Mr. Petrelli made me stand there by his desk as he read it over, as he pointed out the powerful use of non-restrictive clauses, as he advised against the use of cliches, and as he identified more than one historical inaccuracy, and as I squirmed, imagining my father standing in his three-piece suit by Mrs. Baker's desk, large and important, the Chamber of Commerce businessman of 1967, and probably 1968 too. When Mr. Petrelli finished, I hurried back to Mrs. Baker's room, since I wasn't sure that I wanted my father to be standing there, being large and important. But I needn't to hurry, since when I got to the room, my father wasn't standing by Mrs. Baker's desk. We both looked up at the clock. 12:11. 11 lousy minutes after 12 o'clock, and he wasn't here yet. I ran down to the main administrative office and called Hood and Associates. "I'm sorry," said his secretary. "Mr. Hood has been out at the site of the new junior high school all day, and he isn't expected back until 2:30. "He has a baseball game at 2 o'clock, I said. "No, he has an important meeting with the Chamber of Commerce scheduled for 4:30. He wouldn't miss a Chamber of Commerce meeting for a baseball game." She was right. He wouldn't. I hung up the phone and went back to the classroom. Mrs. Baker was reading in her Shakespeare book when I came back. "Oh," she said when she saw me. She looked up at the clock. "Oh," she said again. Mary Lee came back into the room. She stood at the door when she saw me. "Aren't you—" And then she stopped, because apparently I wasn't. One by one, everyone came back from lunch recess. One by one, they looked at me and knew what had happened. And what was there to say? I sat down at my desk as humiliated as President Johnson would have been if he had lost to Bobby Kennedy. My heart beat against my chest. I was surprised that no one else could hear it. I suppose there may have been a more miserable hour sometime in my life, but I couldn't think of what it might have been. Until 1:55, when everyone left for Temple Bethel or St. Adalbert's, and Mrs. Baker said, "Mr. Hood, I think I could get you there for some of the game." The sweetest words e'er spoken. I almost cried. I took the 2 tickets out of my shirt pocket and held them up. "Have you ever been to a Yankee game, Mrs. Baker?" "Never intentionally," she said. "Call your mother and see if it's all right." Which I did, except she wasn't home, so I called my sister at high school. "You're calling me at school for that? Why should I care what time you'll be back?" she said, which I figured was good enough. And that was how Mrs. Baker and I found ourselves on the Long Island Expressway, driving toward New York City, me looking at my watch every 3 minutes or so, and Mrs. Baker moving along at a steady 45 miles per hour in a 60-mile-per-hour zone. "You can go up to 65 without getting a ticket," I pointed out. I tend not to want to see how far I can break the law before I'm caught. You drove a lot faster than this to the hospital, much faster, but I was going to the hospital. Today, I am driving to a baseball game. On opening day, it's just as important, I said, and I just saw you roll your eyes. I never roll my eyes, said Mrs. Baker, but if I did roll my eyes, that would have been an appropriate time to do so. The whole way, she never passed 45. She fussed at the Whitestone Bridge toll to get the right change, and she fussed on the parking lot because she wanted to find a space with no cars on either side, which there weren't any of within 3 miles, and that was about how far away we parked. And we didn't run to Yankee Stadium in 7-minute miles, let me tell you. So it was the bottom of the 3rd inning by the time that Mrs. Baker and I reached our box seats, which were on the first baseline right next to the Yankee dugout. You could make out every pinstripe on every uniform. We were that close. Mr. Hupfer got up and let me sit in front with Danny and Doug, and he sat behind us with Mrs. Baker and Mr. Switek, and Danny never asked about Mrs. Baker being there, even though I knew he wanted to. But I didn't care anymore because it was April, and it was opening day at Yankee Stadium, and the California Angels were out in the field, and the Yankees were up at bat. The game was everything it was supposed to be. Horace Clarke turned a double play off his heel, and Joe Pepitone caught a pop fly over his shoulder. Frank Fernandez had hit the only home run in the 2nd inning, so we missed it, which was a big deal since it won the game. And Mel Stottlemyre threw a 4-hit shutout. Mickey Mantle had 2 singles, so Danny and I couldn't boo him like we wanted to. And when Horace Clarke came out of the dugout for the 7th inning stretch, he tossed 3 balls to us, and we almost had another one off of a Mickey Mantle foul ball, except it hit the bar along the box seats and skipped over us. And Mr. Hupfer and Mr. Switek bought us all, even Mrs. Baker, hot dogs with sauerkraut and more hot dogs with sauerkraut, and Cokes and bottles with the ice still frozen to them, and pretzels as big as both of your hands together, and then another hot dog with sauerkraut for each of us. And we shouted and hollered when the bum ump made a lousy call on Joe Pepitone that made him strike out, and everybody, even Mrs. Baker, stood and cheered when Mel Stottlemyre retired 10 batters in a row. It was just swell. But what happened afterward, that was just swell too. Joe Pepitone and Horace Clarke yelled up to our box at the end of the game, "Hey, Danny, Holling, Doug," they called just like that. "Hey, Danny, Holling, Doug." There wasn't a kid within earshot that didn't wish that they were us. "Hey," we called back. "You want to come down on the field?" asked Horace Clarke, which we didn't need to answer because we were already climbing over the railing. That was when Joe Pepitone saw Mrs. Baker. "You're that dame that got us to come out to school that last December," he said. "Let me tell you, I wasn't sure Mrs. Baker had ever been called that dame before, and I was sure she wasn't all that happy about it now." Mrs. Baker crossed her arms over her chest, even though I had coached her against that. "Yes," she said, "though it was my brother-in-law who contacted you." She said it in this frozen voice that would have quieted any 7th grade class in half a second. But Joe Pepitone didn't notice. He took a step closer. "Aren't you that dame that ran in Melbourne? The women's 4x100? You anchored, right?" I was really sure that Mrs. Baker had never been called that dame twice in 2 sentences that came one after the other. "Yes," she said. "I saw that race. You were in 5th place when you got the baton, and you almost made it all up in the last 100. You came in something like 3/10 of a second behind." 2/10, said Mrs. Baker. "Hey, Horace," said Joe Pepitone, "do you know who this is? Get Hulk over here and see if he remembers that dame we saw anchor the 4x100 relay in Melbourne, and get Cox over here, too." And that was why, when the photographers came to take pictures after the game, They found most of the Yankees around that dame with the legs that almost made up 5 places in the Melbourne Olympic Games in just 100 meters. And after she ran the race with them again 5 times over, she asked the Yankees to show us around the stadium, and they did. Really. Joe and Horace took us up in the bleachers and to the sky-high seats, and then down beneath to the locker rooms, which Mrs. Baker did not go in, and around to the offices, and then through the dugout and back out onto the field. The people who were still up in the stands saw me and Danny pitch to Joe Pepitone, with Jake Gibbs catching, and I don't think Mrs. Baker rolled her eyes once. And afterward, I ran around all the bases, from home to first, to second to third, and back to home. And then I ran to the outfield and sprinted from right to left and back again. And all the while, the green grass and the yellow diamond dust were in my nose, and the sun lowering over Yankee Stadium shone down on me, Holling Hood, playing center field for the New York Yankees and waiting for the crack of the bat. When you have the chance to run the outfield of Yankee Stadium and you're not exactly sure if you'll ever have another chance, you have to take things as they come. I ran back to pitch my last pitches. The sun was getting low by the time Joe Pepitone had smacked them out, and Mrs. Baker stood at home plate, surveying the place like she was considering buying it. "What is all that scaffolding up there for?" she asked. Maybe she was considering buying it. "Repairs," said Joe. "Lots of places in the stadium need repairs. They're waiting on the boss finding an architect." "An architect," said Mrs. Baker. "Someone classical, the boss says, real classical." "I'd like to meet him," said Mrs. Baker. "If you can hit my fastball," said Mel Stottlemyre, "I'll take you up to meet him." Mrs. Baker looked at me and rolled her eyes. "Get me a bat, Mr. Hood," she said. It turned out that Mr. Hupfer drove me and Danny home that night. Mrs. Baker stayed to meet the boss. Mrs. Baker was in the Hometown Chronicle 2 days later, standing next to Danny and Doug and me, and all of us surrounded by smiling Yankee players. I wore Joe Pepitone's jacket to school, and Danny wore his hat, and Doug wore Horace Clarke's hat. 3 sixth graders asked for my autograph on a baseball, which I gave them. Coach Quattrini, however, did not ask for an autograph. He kept his promise, and the next cross-country practice was about as hard as 2 practices put together. And since he believed in democracy, he said, he figured that everyone should have the same cross-country practice. And so all 7 of the varsity runners ran like Brutus and Cassius were after them with long and pointy knives. The 8th graders loved me after that. They threw all of my clothes in the showers, and I walked home, leaving puddles at every step. So when spring break finally came, it dropped as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. Spring break! Were there any 2 words ever put together that make a more beautiful sound? Spring break. Let me tell you, the days were warm and green. Danny, my tea, Marilee, and I met at Woolworth's in the afternoons. We ordered Cokes and hamburgers for as long as our allowances held out. Spring break. The high school was out too, and so my sister was always in a happy, happy mood. She had a new friend named Chit. That really was his name, and he drove a yellow VW Bug with bright pink and orange flower decals. He was mostly legs and arms and hair, and he had come over every afternoon and would go down to the basement with my sister, and they would listen to her transistor radio and then come upstairs singing about yellow submarines very loudly and laughing like it was the funniest thing in the world. Afterward, Chit would fold himself into his yellow Bug, and my sister would go driving around with him. Spring break. Warm and green days. You know they aren't going to last, but when you start in on them, they're like a week of summer plunked down as a gift in the middle of junior high school. They mean the smell of dust and grass on a baseball diamond, the first fresh sea breezes that come all the way inland from Long Island Sound, all the maples decked out in green gold leaves. They mean checking the tennis rackets to see if the winter has warped them